If you've ever looked at your relationship and thought, I know this isn't healthy, so why can't I leave? You're not weak, you're not naive, and you are definitely not alone. Today we're talking about trauma bonds and why awareness doesn't always make leaving easier. Welcome to Pattern Breakers Collective. I'm your host, Lisa Lucia. This podcast is for anyone who has ever looked back at a relationship and wondered how something that once felt so meaningful slowly became confusing, controlling, or painful. For many years, I've worked alongside survivors, and I am a survivor myself. And through those experiences, I've seen how powerful it can be when women begin to understand the patterns behind abusive relationships, not from a place of blame, but from a place of clarity. Throughout this podcast, you're going to hear me use he when referring to an abusive partner. I do that because statistically, most abuse is perpetrated by men, and also that was my personal experience. But abuse can happen in any relationship, regardless of gender or identity, and I want to acknowledge that very clearly. Pattern Breakers Collective exists to help you understand what happened, reclaim your voice, and break patterns that once felt impossible to escape. So let's get into today's conversation. In the last episode, we talked about recognizing abuse, not the dramatic version people usually picture, but the quieter kind. The erosion, the walking on eggshells, the way you slowly start disappearing inside the relationship. And I know that for some of you, that episode probably landed pretty hard. You may have felt seen in a way you weren't expecting. You may have felt validated, but also unsettled. Because once you start recognizing the pattern, a different question usually shows up right behind it. If I can see this so clearly, why can't I leave? For a lot of women, that question becomes its own kind of torment. Because now you're not only dealing with the relationship, you're also judging yourself for not being able to walk away from it. That question often carries so much shame for so many women. Because once awareness arrives, we expect action to follow. We assume that if we understand what's happening, we should be able to make a decision and move. But real life is rarely that clean. What that question often overlooks is everything else that's happening underneath the surface. Attachment, fear, history, investment, hope, and the very real ways the nervous system adapts inside of unhealthy relationships. That's what we're going to talk about today. There is a huge difference between understanding something intellectually and feeling emotionally ready to act on it. A woman can know very clearly that something in the relationship is wrong. She can recognize that the same behaviors keep happening, that the pattern is not changing, and that the relationship is hurting her, and still feel completely frozen when she thinks about actually leaving. That freeze response is so often misunderstood. People assume it means indecision or weakness or denial, but most often it means that something much deeper is happening. I've worked with women who could name every red flag with pinpoint clarity. They understood the cycle. They could identify the gaslighting. They could describe the control. They knew intellectually that the relationship was not healthy. And yet, the moment they imagined actually leaving, panic would show up. That panic doesn't mean that they were weak. It means something inside of them was deeply attached to the life that they had built, even while another part of them was beginning to understand that the relationship was hurting them. There's another belief that sits quietly beneath a lot of the shame that women feel in these situations, and it's something that I would really love to dismantle. Our culture tends to tell a very simple story about abuse. The story usually goes something like this. If a woman is strong, she leaves the first time someone crosses a line. If she's educated or self-aware, she recognizes the behavior immediately and walks away. If she's successful or independent, she would never allow herself to stay in something harmful. But real life doesn't work that way. Strength does not make someone immune to attachment. Intelligence does not override emotional bonding. And success in the outside world doesn't automatically translate into safety inside of an intimate relationship. Over the years, I have sat with women from all kinds of backgrounds, stay-at-home moms, women working long hours and still struggling to make ends meet, caregivers, students, professionals, business owners, therapists, and women in leadership. Some were holding entire households together, while some were making high-level decisions at work every day. Some were just trying to get through the week. Abuse touches women across every kind of life circumstance, and from outside, many of them looked incredibly capable. And yet, when it came to their relationships, many of them felt incredibly stuck. Not because they were unaware of the problems, not because they lacked confidence or intelligence, but because attachment doesn't respond to information the way people think it should. The part of us that bonds to another person responds to connection, history, emotional investment, and the life that has slowly been built around that relationship. That's why something can look obvious from the outside and still feel incredibly hard to untangle from the inside. So when people say things like, well, why didn't she just leave? Or I would never stay in something like that, they're usually imagining a situation from the outside where everything looks crystal clear. But inside the relationship, it rarely feels that clear. And understanding the difference is incredibly important because once we understand it, we can begin replacing shame with compassion, not just for other women, but for ourselves. I want to share something personal here for a moment because I think it's important for people to understand this part. There was a time in my life when I could clearly explain why a relationship wasn't healthy. I could list the red flags, I could describe the manipulation, I could see the pattern unfolding in real time. And here's the part that might surprise people. I knew those signs because I had literally been trained to recognize them. I had worked with survivors. I had sat in rooms with women telling their stories. I had learned the dynamics of abuse, the cycles, the warning signs. I had been taught what coercive control looks like, how gaslighting works, how manipulation slowly erodes someone's confidence. This wasn't theoretical knowledge for me. It was something I had been trained to see. So from the outside, it might seem like that knowledge might have made everything obvious, that I would have seen the signs and immediately walked away. But that's not how attachment works. Knowing the signs doesn't cancel out the bond you've built with someone. Because while my mind could identify the pattern, my life was still wrapped up in the relationship. I had invested time, emotion, energy, and a future that I believed in. There were plans, shared experiences, and a piece of my identity that I had become intertwined with being in that relationship. So even though I could intellectually explain what was happening, the idea of actually leaving felt unbearable. It wasn't confusing to me, it was terrifying. It felt like stepping off of a cliff because leaving wouldn't have just meant ending the relationship, it would have meant dismantling the life that I had built around it. The routines, the shared dreams, the version of myself that existed inside of that partnership. And when people talk about leaving like it's a simple decision, they often overlook that part. Leaving isn't just walking away from a person. Sometimes it means unraveling an entire chapter of your life. And your nervous system doesn't treat that lightly. It treats it like a threat, which is why even when your mind understands the pattern, your body can still feel deeply attached to that person. That conflict between what you know and what you feel can be so incredibly confusing, but it's also incredibly human. Sometimes when women say, I don't know why I can't leave, what they really mean is, I'm terrified. They're terrified of what will happen if it gets worse, terrified of retaliation, terrified of being alone, terrified of the financial reality, terrified of being judged, terrified of starting over, and terrified of making the wrong choice and having to live with it. And sometimes awareness actually increases that fear at first, because once you really see the pattern, you also have to face what it means if the pattern doesn't change. You have to sit with the possibility that this is probably not going to get any better, and that is a very heavy thing to hold. One of the reasons this feels so confusing is because attachment doesn't operate the way we think it should. And that gap between what you know and what you feel is where so much of the struggle lives. There's also another piece of this that often makes the whole situation even harder, and that piece is shame. Shame tends to show up quietly, but once it's there, it can be incredibly forceful. It sounds like a voice in your head saying things like, I should know better, or I'm the one who tells my friends they deserve better, or even I teach other people about boundaries. How did I end up here? That kind of internal dialogue can be brutal because once shame takes hold, it doesn't just make you feel bad about the situation, it makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you start believing that something about you is flawed or foolish, it becomes much harder to look at the relationship with clarity. Instead of examining what's happening, you start criticizing yourself for being in it. Instead of asking, what is this pattern? You start asking, what's wrong with me? And that shift is important because shame has a very specific effect on people. It tends to make us go quiet. We stop talking about what's happening. We stop sharing the details. We stop asking for help. Not because we don't need support, but because we're afraid of being judged or misunderstood or exposed. So we keep it inside. And the more isolated we feel, the harder it becomes to break the cycle. Because abuse and manipulation tend to thrive in isolation. When no one else can see what's happening and the story only lives inside your own mind, it becomes much easier to keep doubting yourself. And that's one of the reasons shame can actually deepen the attachment. Not because shame creates the bond, but because shame keeps you alone inside of it. When you're ashamed, you're less likely to reach out to someone who might help you see the pattern more clearly. You're less likely to say out loud what's happening. You're less likely to hear another perspective that might shift something inside of you. And without those outside voices, the relationship becomes the loudest voice in your world. So if you've ever found yourself thinking, God, I can't tell anyone about this, or I just don't think they'd understand, or I should have left already, so now it's just embarrassing to admit that I'm still here. Please know that those thoughts are incredibly common. They're not proof that you're weak, though. And understanding that can be the first step in loosening its grip, because the moment that shame is spoken out loud, it often begins to lose some of its power. So instead of only asking, why can't I just leave? It may be more compassionate to ask different questions, like, what is it that I'm attached to? What am I afraid of? What would leaving disrupt? What part of me still hopes? Those are honest questions, and honesty is often where the trauma bonds begin to loosen. So now that we've made space for the shame, now that we've acknowledged that awareness doesn't automatically equal action, I want to talk about what's actually happening underneath all of this. Because when you don't understand trauma bonds, you call yourself weak. When you do understand them, you start to recognize that something deeper is happening. You begin to understand it as wiring, and wiring can be rewired. One of the most important things to understand about trauma bonds is how they actually form. The name itself can sound complicated or clinical, but the process behind it is something very human. Trauma bonds tend to develop in relationships where intense emotional experiences repeat over time, especially when fear or distress is followed by relief from the very same person. So let me explain what this can look like in real life. Imagine being in a relationship where tension starts building. Something feels off. Maybe he's quiet, distant, irritated, or unpredictable. You can feel the shift in the room, even if nothing has been said yet. So you start adjusting. You become more careful with your words. You watch his mood. You try to prevent what might be coming next. Your body feels it immediately before your mind has even had time to catch up. Your heart rate goes up, your muscles tighten, you feel anxious, alert, and on edge. That is your nervous system activating. Your brain begins releasing stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, preparing your body to deal with a threat. And then Eventually, something happens. An argument, accusations, yelling, emotional withdrawal, maybe something physical, something that confirms that the tension you were already feeling was real. Your nervous system spikes even more. But then, after the conflict, something shifts again. He softens. Maybe he apologizes. Maybe he cries. Maybe he blames stress, his childhood, his mental health, or promises that this time he finally understands. Maybe he becomes especially attentive for a few days, and you find yourself thinking that maybe something really did shift. Sometimes he even goes to therapy. And in that moment, your body exhales. The tension drops, your nervous system begins calming down, and your brain releases a different set of chemicals, things like dopamine and oxytocin, the same chemicals involved in bonding and connection. Dopamine is often described as the reward chemical. It's released when your brain experiences relief after stress, and it reinforces whatever behavior or situation led to that relief. So, after hours, or sometimes days, of tension and fear, the moment things feel okay again can feel incredibly powerful. It can feel like closeness, like connection, like love. But what your body is actually bonding to in that moment is the relief from the stress. And over time, that pattern repeats: tension, conflict, reconciliation. Your nervous system starts to associate that relief with the person themselves, even if they were the one who caused the fear in the first place. Your brain begins learning a rhythm: stress, relief, stress, relief, stress, relief. And every time that relief comes, dopamine reinforces the connection. So the bond becomes stronger, not because you enjoy the chaos, not because you're choosing pain, but because your body adapted to a repeated emotional pattern. And once your nervous system learns that rhythm, it can begin to anticipate it. Even when your mind is starting to recognize that something is not healthy. This is why trauma bonds can feel so powerful, because they're not just emotional, they're neurological, they're chemical, and they're reinforced over time through repetition. This isn't irrational behavior. It's a nervous system responding exactly the way human nervous systems are designed to respond. Another part of what makes these relationships so difficult to walk away from is unpredictability. Human beings are naturally wired to look for patterns. So when someone's behavior is inconsistent, warm one day, cold the next, loving after being cruel, the mind starts searching for explanation. You replay conversations, you think about what you said, and wonder what shifted. Part of you is trying to understand how to get back to the version of the relationship that felt safe or hopeful. That's where so much effort can start getting misplaced. Instead of stepping back and asking whether the dynamic itself is healthy, you begin focusing on what you could do differently. Maybe if you explained it in a better way. Maybe if you had stayed calmer. Maybe if you avoided certain topics. Maybe if you were more patient. And that effort often comes from a very sincere place. It comes from caring, from loyalty, and from genuinely wanting the relationship to work. But over time, that can create a quiet and exhausting shift where more and more of the emotional responsibility starts living on your side of the relationship. You become the one monitoring the environment, trying to keep things steady, trying to protect the good moments. I've heard many survivors describe this in almost the same words. If I could just figure out the right way to handle things, we could just stay in the good place. They weren't ignoring the difficult moments, they were just trying to prevent them. In their minds, they weren't staying in something harmful. They were trying to stabilize something that mattered to them. But when that happens, trying harder can start to feel like love, even when the dynamic itself is what's causing the harm. And that is one of the reasons that these relationships become so psychologically sticky. Not because the person is blind to the pain, but because so much energy has gone into trying to restore the version of the relationship that once felt hopeful. And there's another layer here that people don't always recognize right away. Sometimes the bond is not only to the person, but also to the version of yourself that existed inside the relationship. Maybe you were the one who understood him better than anyone else, the one who believed in his potential, or the one who could calm him down, make sense of him, or hold everything together. Those roles can become incredibly meaningful, and over time, they can shape your identity. So when the relationship begins to unravel, you're not just losing the connection with him, you're also losing the role you played in that story. And that can create its own kind of grief. Over time, what started as love becomes intertwined with effort, hope, identity, and survival. That's why walking away can feel so much harder than the people on the outside often imagine. Because by that point, leaving is no longer just about ending a relationship. It's about stepping away from a pattern your mind has tried to make sense of, a role you have lived inside of, and a connection your body has adapted around. And when something has become that deeply woven into your emotional world, creating distance doesn't always feel like a relief at first. Sometimes it feels like a withdrawal. And that's what I want to talk about next. When we understand how trauma bonds develop through repeated emotional intensity, unpredictability, and the powerful relief that follows conflict, it becomes easier to understand something that often surprises people. Breaking that bond rarely feels clean or straightforward. From the outside, people often imagine that once someone recognizes a relationship is unhealthy, leaving will feel like a clear and empowering decision. They picture a moment of strength where someone walks away and immediately feels lighter, freer, and certain. But for many survivors, the emotional experience after leaving looks very different. Instead of relief, what they often feel first is disorientation. And that reaction can be super confusing, especially when they believed leaving would immediately solve the pain. One of the first things many people notice after creating distance from their relationship is the sudden quiet. During the relationship, there may have been constant awareness of the other person's emotional state. Many survivors describe becoming highly attuned to the subtle changes in the mood, the tone, or the behavior. They were often paying attention in ways that felt almost automatic, monitoring environment for signs that the tension is building. Over time, that kind of vigilance can become second nature. So, when the relationship ends, that constant monitoring suddenly has nowhere to go. The emotional atmosphere feels like a void. There are no sudden arguments to brace for, no shifting moods to interpret, no need to carefully choose words in order to avoid escalation. Logically, that quiet may seem like peace, but emotionally, it can feel uneasy. I remember one woman describing it to me by saying that the silence in her home after the breakup felt almost disorienting. She said she had expected relief, but what she felt instead was a strange sense of emptiness, as though someone had suddenly turned off the music in a nightclub. She wasn't missing the arguments or the instability. What she was reacting to was the absence of the intensity her nervous system had grown used to navigating. When someone has spent a long time living inside emotional volatility, the body becomes accustomed to those fluctuations. The nervous system adjusts to the rhythm of the tension building and resolving, even if that rhythm is painful. When the rhythm suddenly stops, the system needs time to recalibrate. And during that period of adjustment, the quiet can feel uncomfortable before it begins to feel safe. Another experience that often surprises survivors is how their memories of the relationship begin to shift after they leave. In the early days after creating distance, many people notice that their minds begin returning to the moments that felt loving or connected. They remember the times where he seemed kind or attentive. They think about the conversations that felt meaningful or the moments when the relationship seemed full of possibility. These memories can surface suddenly, sometimes triggered by something small like a song, a picture, or even a familiar place. When those memories appear, they create doubt. People begin to question themselves. They may wonder whether they were too harsh in their assessment of the relationship or whether they may have misunderstood certain situations. That internal questioning can feel unsettling, especially after someone had worked hard to reach the clarity that led them to leave. But this shift in memory is actually a very common part of how the brain processes loss. When we lose someone who once mattered to us, the mind often revisits the moments that felt meaningful. It tries to make sense of the emotional investment that existed. That process can soften the painful memories temporarily, not because those experiences were unimportant, but because the brain is trying to reconcile the loss of the relationship with the attachment that formed over time. Leaving a relationship doesn't just mean stepping away from the difficulties that were present. It also means letting go of the hopes that existed inside of it. And that can bring a very real sense of grief. And there is another layer to this experience that many survivors don't initially recognize. When a relationship ends, people often focus on the loss of the partner. But sometimes what is also being lost is the role that developed inside the relationship itself. In many trauma-bonded dynamics, individuals gradually begin to take on certain emotional roles. Some people become the stabilizer, the person who works to keep the peace when the tension arises. Others see themselves as the one who understands their partner better than anyone else, the person who believes in their potential even when others do not. These roles can develop slowly, almost without conscious awareness. Over time, they become tied to a sense of identity and purpose within the relationship. So when the relationship ends, there can be a deeper question that emerges beneath the surface. Not only how do I move forward without this person, but also who am I now that this role no longer exists? Even roles that carried a heavy emotional burden can feel familiar. Letting go of that familiarity can take time. These emotional dynamics also help explain something that carries an enormous amount of shame for many survivors: the experience of returning to the relationship after leaving. Many people leave with a strong sense of clarity, only to find themselves reconnecting weeks or months later. When that happens, they often judge themselves ruthlessly. They believe it means that they were weak or that they failed to follow through on their own decisions. But in many cases, what they're experiencing is the continued influence of an attachment that formed under intense emotional conditions. The nervous system had spent a long time adapting to the rhythms of that relationship. When the connection suddenly disappears, the system sometimes looks for the familiarity it once relied on, even when the person intellectually understands that the relationship was harmful. Returning does not erase the awareness that someone gained about the relationship. Often, it just reflects how powerful the bond had become. Understanding that can help replace some of the shame with a little compassion. None of this means you made the wrong decision. It means your mind and body are still adjusting to the absence of something they had adapted around, and that adjustment takes time. I want to share something personal here for a moment because I think it's important for people listening to understand that these dynamics don't just happen to people who don't recognize the signs. I had worked with survivors. I had training in recognizing abusive patterns. I understood coercive control. I could explain the cycle of abuse and the psychological dynamics behind it. And yet, when I was inside my own relationship, I still went through many of the same phases that these survivors describe. I thought about leaving hundreds of times. There were moments when I could see the pattern clearly. I knew the relationship wasn't healthy. There were multiple forms of abuse in the relationship, and intellectually, I understood that staying was harming me. But clarity doesn't automatically dissolve attachment. Even while I understood what was happening, I still found myself going through the same internal questions that so many survivors wrestle with. I would think about the relationship and wonder if I had been too harsh. I would remember the moments when he seemed sincere or vulnerable and start questioning my own perception again. And one question kept coming up in my mind. If I knew the relationship was unhealthy, why did I feel the pull to stay? For a long time, I interpreted that feeling as evidence that something about my thinking must have been wrong. I wondered if maybe the attachment meant I had misunderstood the situation or that I hadn't tried hard enough to make the relationship work. But over time, I began to understand the thing I wish more survivors were told earlier. Missing someone and needing someone are not the same thing. Attachment can exist even after clarity arrives. It doesn't disappear the moment you recognize a pattern, and expecting it to vanish overnight can create a lot of unnecessary shame. For most people, the process is much slower than that. The attachment loosens gradually as distance grows, as your nervous system begins adjusting to a different environment, and as the story of the relationship becomes clearer over time. That process can feel messy. It can include moments of doubt. It can include moments where you start second guessing yourself again. But none of those experiences mean your awareness was wrong. More often, they simply mean you were unwinding a bond that formed under intense emotional conditions. And unwinding something like that takes time. So if you've had moments where you're questioning your own clarity or moments where you miss someone who also hurt you, please know that you are not alone in that experience. Many survivors, including people who understand these dynamics very well, have walked through that same process, and it does not invalidate the truth of what you experienced. For anyone listening who has experienced these feelings, confusion after leaving, moments of longing, or even the shame of returning to the relationship, it is important to understand that these reactions are far more common than people realize. They do not mean that the relationship was healthy. They do not mean that leaving was a mistake. More often, they reflect the process of a nervous system gradually untangling itself from a bond that formed over time. And like most processes that involve deep emotional attachment, that untangling rarely happens all at once. It unfolds slowly with understanding, with distance, and with compassion for yourself along the way. After talking about how powerful trauma bonds can be and why leaving often feels so emotionally disorienting, it raises a very natural question. If these bonds run that deep, how do they actually begin to loosen? Many people imagine that healing begins the moment someone walks away from the relationship. They picture a clean break, followed by clarity and relief. But for most survivors, the process unfolds much earlier than that and much more quietly. In many cases, the bond begins weakening long before the relationship officially ends. The earliest signs rarely look dramatic from the outside. There is usually no single moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. Instead, the process often begins with a growing awareness that something about the relationship just no longer feels right. You might notice yourself hesitating before sharing certain thoughts, or feeling anxious about how something you say might be received. Maybe you begin recognizing how often you're adjusting your behavior in order to prevent tension. Maybe you realize you're no longer asking, how do I bring more of myself into this relationship? And you're only asking, how do I keep this from getting worse? At first, these observations don't necessarily lead to immediate action. Many people still care deeply about their partner and still want the relationship to work. But the awareness itself matters. It introduces a quiet shift in perspective. Instead of assuming that every conflict is simply a misunderstanding or a temporary rough patch, part of your mind begins paying closer attention to the overall pattern. And once that awareness begins to take hold, it becomes harder to ignore. Another shift often happens in the way someone interprets their partner's behavior. Earlier in the relationship, it's pretty common to look for explanations that preserve the connection. When something hurtful happens, many people instinctively try to understand in the most charitable way possible. They might tell themselves that their partner is under a lot of stress, or the situation was just a misunderstanding. Sometimes they believe that if they communicate more clearly or show more patience, that the relationship will return to the closeness that it once had. For a long time, those explanations can feel reasonable. But eventually, the same explanations start to lose their power. You might notice yourself repeating the same justifications again and again, while the underlying pattern continues unchanged. What once felt like a temporary problem starts to feel more like a recurring cycle. When that realization begins to settle in, it can be super uncomfortable. It can challenge the story that once held the relationship together. But it also marks an important turning point because your mind is beginning to see the situation with more honesty. And as that internal clarity grows, many people begin to notice a shift in their emotional connection to their relationship. Interestingly, this shift often occurs long before any physical separation happens. Someone may still be in the relationship outwardly, but internally they start creating just a little more distance. They may share less about their inner thoughts or feel less motivated to repair every disagreement. Apologies that once felt reassuring may begin to feel a little less convincing, especially if the same behaviors keep repeating. What once felt like passionate reconciliation after conflict may start to feel a little emotionally exhausting instead. These changes don't necessarily happen all at once, and they don't always feel empowering. Sometimes they feel like sadness or fatigue. But in many cases, they reflect the mind and body beginning to protect themselves from a pattern that has caused repeated harm. At some point during this process, many survivors notice that their imagination begins drifting toward a different kind of life. These thoughts might start very quietly. Someone might picture what it would feel like to spend time in their own home without tension in the air, or to wake up in the morning without wondering what mood their partner will be in. They may find themselves wondering what it would feel like to be in a relationship where affection is steady rather than unpredictable and where conflict does not carry the same emotional weight. These moments of imagining something different can feel surprisingly powerful, even if no immediate action follows them. They open a small door to the possibility that another way of living might exist outside of the current dynamic. Once that possibility becomes visible, it can slowly change how someone sees the relationship that they're in. During this time, something else often starts happening beneath the surface. As people spend time in environments that feel safer, more supportive, whether that means talking with trusted friends, seeking professional support, or simply experiencing moments of calm outside the relationship, the nervous system starts to adjust. For someone who has spent a long time navigating emotional volatility, those calmer experiences can initially feel unfamiliar. But over time, they create a new reference point for what connection and safety can feel like. Gradually, your body begins recognizing that closeness does not have to be accompanied by tension or fear. And as that realization grows stronger, the intense cycles that once felt compelling can start to feel draining instead. It's also important to acknowledge that this process rarely unfolds in a straight line. Most survivors describe periods of clarity followed by moments of doubt. Some days they feel absolutely certain about their decision to leave or to create distance. Other days they find themselves remembering the good moments and questioning their judgment. This back and forth movement can be super frustrating, especially when someone wants to move forward decisively. But it does not mean that progress isn't happening. In many cases, it simply reflects the natural process of untangling a bond that formed under intense emotional circumstances. With time, the moments of clarity tend to grow stronger and more consistent, while the pull of the old cycle gradually loses its strength. When trauma bonds begin to loosen, the change is rarely dramatic. Most often, it unfolds through a series of small internal shifts, moments of awareness, moments of honesty, and moments when someone begins imagining a life that feels more peaceful than the one they've known. These moments may seem insignificant at first, but together they create movement, and movement is often the beginning of freedom. So if trauma bonds loosen slowly, if clarity builds quietly, and if distance often begins internally before it shows up externally, then the real question becomes, what do you do while it's happening? What do you do in the in-between, in that space where you're aware but not fully free yet, stronger but still attached, clearer but still grieving? This is the space that most women live in for a while, and it deserves guidance, not judgment. Step 1, start with stabilizing yourself, not ending the relationship. When people talk about leaving, they often frame it like a single dramatic decision. But before a door closes, something else has to open. You, your nervous system, your self-trust, your stability. If your body is constantly dysregulated, anxious, hypervigilant, scanning, it's very hard to make grounded decisions. So instead of focusing first on how do I leave, it can be more powerful to ask, how do I stabilize myself? Sometimes stabilizing yourself looks very simple. It might mean spending time with someone whose presence feels calm instead of activating. It might mean being in environments where your body doesn't feel watched or braced. It might mean sleeping more regularly, eating consistently, or reducing your exposure to arguments when you can. You're not solving the relationship yet. You're rebuilding your baseline, and when your baseline shifts, your clarity strengthens. Step 2, rebuilding self-trust. Abusive dynamics chip away at something subtle, your trust in your own perception. You stop believing your instincts. You second-guess your discomfort. You silence your intuition. So part of weakening the bond is strengthening your internal voice again. That can begin in very quiet ways. When something feels off, instead of dismissing it, you pause and simply acknowledge it. You might say to yourself, well, that didn't feel good. You don't immediately explain it away, minimize it, or argue with yourself. You just let it be true. That acknowledgement is powerful because self-trust isn't built through grand declarations. It's rebuilt through consistent self-validation. Step 3, expand your world again. One of the strongest threads in trauma bonds is isolation. Your world narrows, your focus centers on him, your energy revolves around the cycle. So part of unwinding the bond is gently expanding your world again. That doesn't mean announcing everything. That doesn't mean confronting anyone. It might simply mean reaching out to an old friend, spending time with family, listening to content that reflects your reality, or returning to activities that remind you who you were before the relationship consumed so much emotional space. Every time you experience connection outside of him, the bond shifts slightly because your nervous system begins to learn, I can feel okay without him. That realization is enormous. Step 4, reduce emotional reactivity. Another part of reclaiming yourself is learning not to engage in every cycle invitation. When he provokes, when he escalates, when he tries to pull you back into an argument, you may not always be able to change his behavior, but you can slowly change your participation. It might mean not responding immediately, not defending every accusation, not over-explaining, and not trying to restore peace at your own expense. This isn't about punishing him. It's about protecting you. And every time you don't re-enter the cycle in the same way, your nervous system strengthens. Step 5, allow yourself to grieve. Here's the emotional piece that often gets skipped. You may need to grieve before you leave. Grieve the version of him you hoped for. Grieve the future you imagined. Grieve the love that felt real in the moments. Grieve the time invested. Grieve the energy spent trying. Grief does not mean that you're going back. Grief means you cared, and caring is human. But you can care and still choose yourself. Step 6, slow preparation. Now, if leaving is something that you're considering, preparation can begin quietly. You don't have to make announcements. You don't have to declare anything. Preparation might look like learning about your finances, understanding your options, talking confidently to someone you trust, exploring resources, saving small amounts of money where possible, or documenting patterns. Preparation shifts your nervous system from powerless to prepared, and being prepared reduces panic. Even if you don't leave tomorrow, knowing you could changes something inside of you. And the most important shift, at some point, the question is going to change. Instead of asking yourself, can I survive without him? You begin asking, can I survive like this forever? That shift is quiet, but it is decisive. And when you start prioritizing long-term peace over short-term relief, the bond weakens dramatically because you're no longer chasing the high. You are evaluating the cost. If you are in the middle of this, attached, aware, conflicted, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to rush. You do not need to prove strength. You do not need to perform empowerment. You need stability, clarity, support, and compassion. Trauma bonds unravel at the pace of safety, and your safety, emotional and physical, matters more than speed. Before we close today, I want to leave you with something important. If you are struggling to leave, if you've left and felt pulled back, or if you've gone back and feel ashamed of that, please hear this clearly. Trauma bonds don't mean you're weak. They mean your nervous system adapted to survive something intense. Understanding the pattern is not failure. It's the beginning of freedom. And breaking these cycles doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly through awareness, support, and each small moment where you begin choosing yourself again. If this episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it also. And if you want to keep learning how these patterns work and how to break them, make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep breaking the patterns that no longer serve you.